support the economy of First Nations, so it doesn't apply to those. It's also about governing Aboriginal and treaty rights together rather than separate, as the Supreme Court of Canada treats them. It applies to fishers who have Indian status under the Indian Act, whether they live on or off reserve. And it's really about empowering fishers and people in the role of fisheries governance. And these are based on the interviews that I've completed between December 2019 and January 2021. Also, governance. Governance does not necessarily imply government or the rule of law in government. Governance is the capacity to get things done without necessarily having the legal competence to demand that they be done. It's through the interactive processes in which society and the economy are steered towards collectively negotiated objectives. Another term, another concept, legitimacy. It's defined as whether political actions are perceived as right or just by those impacted or affected by it. And lastly, effectiveness. Does it do what it's supposed to do? So whether actions have intended effects. And also, sorry, there's one more, communal. So this is a concept that has many different meanings. So belonging to or relating to a community as whole, relating to different groups within a society, used or shared in common by everyone in a group. So some examples could be the Mi'kmaq Nation as communal, a First Nation as communal, or First Nations as communal, or even groups of Mi'kmaq individuals can be also considered communal. So despite the recognition of the treaty right to fish for a moderate livelihood, referred to the Marshall decision in 1999, TFO failed to create a path for its implementation. And this is a complex governance issue, given the historical, political, and legal context of Mi'kmaq Aboriginal and treaty rights. So legal pluralism, importantly, plays a role in the empowerment of a dual legal system and mutual rights for self-determination, as Section 35 and 52 of the Constitution Act. So this creates challenges for abiding by Canadian law, yet empowers the Mi'kmaq with the ability to make law. Pre-Confederation treaties did not extinguish Mi'kmaq sovereignty, and the imposition of the Indian Act to divide Indigenous nations into First Nations and replace traditional forms of governance. Further, the interpretation of case law limits Aboriginal treaty rights in today's context, but also notes that they are able to evolve with society. Regardless, the Mi'kmaq fisheries assert their treaty right to fish for moderate livelihood in Nova Scotia. So my research question, how can Mi'kmaq Aboriginal treaty rights to fish be governed in Nova Scotia, is explored using three related questions. First, it was an interest to determine an image of the Mi'kmaq fisheries undertaken by Aboriginal or undertaken through Aboriginal treaty rights. Second, I needed a framework to develop and understand some of the opportunities and current challenges to governance using two case studies, one being Atlantic salmon, which is a species in decline here in Nova Scotia, and the American lobster as an example of the treaty right to fish for a moderate livelihood, which is not in decline or assessed by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And third, by examining these case studies, limits to current governance was identified to provide some of those insights into the development of the fisheries governance model. So some of my theoretical propositions were developed to underpin my analytical framework. The Western governance system seems at odds with the multiplicity of Indigenous knowledge systems. Two, understanding the challenges and opportunities arising from these different systems can lead to mutually beneficial outcomes. And implementing a self-governing arrangement for Mi'kmaq Aboriginal treaty rights is more likely to be successful using shared values and beliefs and addressing issues of social justice. So understanding the interplay between knowledge systems is justification to the fishworks research. So the theoretical framework chosen was two-eyed seeing. And two-eyed seeing refers to the use of the strengths of Indigenous and Western knowledges for the benefit of all. And knowledge systems are underpinned by beliefs and values, and as such, the knowledge systems are often at odds because of conflicting values and beliefs. Thus, the interplay between knowledge systems can often result in tensions. And two-eyed seeing recognizes that these tensions can lead to a greater understanding of those differences, and the use of shared values and beliefs can bridge knowledge systems. And it was really privileged. It was really an honor to listen to Elder Albert Marshall last month in a session we held for some of our DFO colleagues. And he so succinctly described two-eyed seeing. He said, user differences for the benefit of all. That's two-eyed seeing. So this framework is underpinned by social justice, and social justice is, in that broadest sense, about the treatment, the fair treatment, including the respect for the rights of minorities or those oppressed by society, and that results in transformative action. So there's an alignment between two-eyed seeing actions and also social justice actions. So another theory that contributed to how I analyzed my research and to design governance is the interactive governance theory, or IGT. It's a complementary theory to knowledge systems and social justice. And it emphasizes the prominence of values underpinning governance. It recognizes that multiple modes of governance exist and recognizes the need to shift power to improve governance. So IGT conceptualizes governance as being comprised of three interrelated parts. The system being governed comprises both the natural and the social systems, which are also comprised of properties impacting its capacity to be governed or its governability, depending on how diverse, complex, dynamic, or vulnerable the system is. And the governing system is composed of the elements and modes, and of course the orders. The elements refer to the intentional components that contribute to governability, and this is based on the image of the fishery and where it needs to be, and the instruments and actions used to get there. Three governing modes are recognized, each with its own style of governing interactions. Hierarchical as a top-down approach uses law, policy, and sanctions as governing interactions, and is the DFO way. Hierarchical governing is theorized in IGT to be better suited to address vulnerable or fragile ecosystems. Self-governing is the most informal and decentralized mode, with decisions being made by those closest to the problem, and is theorized to be better suited to address diversity. And co-governing refers to arrangements where parties join hands to cooperate, coordinate, and communicate as the governing interactions. So co-governing is theorized to be better suited to address complex and dynamic situations where interaction is needed for learning and to address conflict between user groups. And the last component are the orders in which governance is operationalized. Meta order refers to the overarching principles and values of the governing system. These are then reflected in the structures and the institutions that determine the constraints and opportunities for governance, referred to as the second order. And lastly, the first order refers to the relationship of how people and their institutional structures solve problems as influenced by meta order principles and second order institutional structures. So the governing interactions are processes influence governance, and the key areas where power relations emerge between the governing system and the system to be governed. And IGT posits that there is a relationship between the mode of governing system and the properties of the system to be governed and its compatibility to respond to those properties. And often what we see in governance today is there is just one type of governance expected to respond to the different needs that are out there. And this is something that my research is showing is not there. So the case study method was used in addition to the interviews that were conducted. The methods consisted of a design phase, a data collection and analysis phase. So using data from semi-structured interviews from 52 participants and both the salmon and lobster case studies, and a comparative analytical phase, which allowed for testing of the consistency of the existing theory and the propositions with the cross-case findings and allowed for insights to support the development of the governance model. So I'll now turn to the results. So Mi'kmaq participants noted the concepts of fishing and terminology for Aboriginal and treaty rights, while they have distinct legal meaning, are interconnected. So many fishers referred to the treaty right as inclusive of the Aboriginal right, as the Treaty of 1752 reinforced the Mi'kmaq free liberty of hunting and fishing. And based on Mi'kmaq values that emerged in the interviews, the image of the Mi'kmaq fisheries is one that supports individuals and collective physical, spiritual, cultural, and economic needs, yet is self-governed, ethical, shared, responsible, conservative, respectful, and intermittent. And this image is in stark contrast with the image of fisheries as the tragedy of the commons, where access to public resources, if not controlled, will act in their own interest and deplete or destroy those resources. And of course, this isn't the case. The Mi'kmaq have been interacting with their resources or gifts for many, many years, and they were guided by their cultural teachings, such as Netigalunk. So regarding the understanding of the challenges and opportunities identified by the participants, 3 participant groups were created. Mi'kmaq comprised of Mi'kmaq fishers, leaders, and those working in Mi'kmaq or Indigenous organizations, and that's shown there in blue. The federal and provincial perspective, which was DFO in the province of Nova Scotia, are shown in gray. And the mixed category were those who were not Mi'kmaq, employed in Indigenous organizations, and non-Mi'kmaq fishers. So 6 categories of identified challenges emerged from the analysis of the interview. The Mi'kmaq identified with all 6, but emphasized conflicting relations, disputing the legitimacy of the governing system, and marginalizing Mi'kmaq fishers. For the federal and provincial participants, disputing the legitimacy of the governing system and identifying governance gaps were emphasized as the 2 most significant challenges, and not surprising, I don't know if there's a mouse somewhere, and not surprising, they did not see fearing loss of Mi'kmaq identity as a challenge. And the mixed participants generally align more closely with the Mi'kmaq findings, except for identifying governance gaps. So importantly, there were subcategories of challenges for the Mi'kmaq participants. While there are conflicting relations between the Mi'kmaq and non-Mi'kmaq fishers, as well as between the Mi'kmaq and DFO, internal conflict was also revealed. And these are evident as the division in political organization and leadership, and the lack of coordination and collaboration with the Mi'kmaq Grand Council. And while both the Mi'kmaq and the DFO provincial participants disputed the legitimacy of each other's governing system, internal disputes were also revealed. Mi'kmaq fishers also disputed the legitimacy of the Mi'kmaq governing system regarding the outcomes of consultations and negotiations with DFO, including agreements and license conditions, and between the Mi'kmaq Grand Council and First Nations governments. So based in interactive governance theory, these challenges indicate low governability, specific to how governance is operationalized. So they require the need to analyze and examine these governing orders. So turning to the opportunities, 5 categories emerged. Here, founding governance on Mi'kmaq knowledge system was the most frequently cited opportunity, emphasized by the Mi'kmaq. While the federal provincial perspective emphasized using current governing processes. So this would be the Mi'kmaq, and that would be the federal provincial perspective. And significantly, all 3 perspectives led by the mixed participants recognize the opportunity of improving relations by forging a relationship, as shown as the bars on the extreme right here. Here, the Mi'kmaq want a treaty relationship with Canada and recognize the need to unite for solidarity and to act collectively despite reserved boundaries. So I'll now turn to the final results section regarding limits to governance. So drawing on those 2 case studies, again, I had mentioned before that salmon are very scarce and have a very complicated life cycle in comparison to lobster, which are not complex and have a very simple life cycle. You know, based on these 2 case studies and how the rights were interacting with the access to these species, 3 important insights were derived. So first, the properties of the system to be governed. If you can see my mouse. The properties of the system to be governed indicate that all 3 governing modes are needed despite the differences in vulnerability of the natural systems, such as the example of Atlantic salmon that continues to be in decline. And second, through the cross-case analysis, governance gaps directly contributed to the challenges. So the absence of co-governance contributes to poor relations and lack of cross-cultural exchange. And where self-governance is absent or where emerging, it is insufficient and contributes to marginalization, exclusion, and lack of participation of Mi'kmaq fishers in governing interactions and decision-making. And third, vulnerability as an issue of conservation to justify the infringement of Mi'kmaq Aboriginal treaty rights was not found to play a pivotal role in determining the appropriate governing mode. So my research showed that it's really more about complexity and context that plays the key role in determining the most appropriate governing mode. And in fact, co-governing rather than hierarchical is more appropriate for vulnerable species such as salmon. And this is contrary to the Supreme Court of Canada ruling that federal government can infringe Aboriginal treaty rights for issues of conservation. And self-governing rather than co-governing is more appropriate for non-vulnerable species such as lobster, where legal pluralism is present. So using the knowledge shared by the participants and the insights gained from my research, I'll turn to the alternative fisheries governance model as my discussion. I thought I'd include a quote here because it did have a profound impact on me. And it wasn't Marshall that propelled the Mi'kmaq into their expressions of their rights to fish. It's been going on for a long time, out of sight and out of mind, hidden under and concealed under darkness. There's lots of objects being burned and protests and threats and racial threats to a whole nation. It pretty much is, it seems like a technical war that's been going on for a very long time. But I find the new generation, the young guys, they don't want to hide. They don't want to go in the dark no more, and that's good because I'm here. I've been in the dark, and I have a clear understanding now that we have the right to be in the light. So let's go. Let's stop hiding. So the model focuses on enhancing the performance of these three orders shown on the left, the meta order, second order, and first order, to address the challenges while also incorporating those opportunities identified by the participants. First, to address the gaps in governing modes, a self-governing component is the missing link to current governance and is recommended to enhance legitimacy and governance and effectiveness. So I'll go through each of the modes and orders, and starting with the second and first orders and with the self-governing Mi'kmaq District Fisher Association. So the self-governing association was designed according to Ostrom's design principles for collective action. Here, organizing geographically as Mi'kmaq districts allows for the incorporation of traditional Mi'kmaq governance and creates boundaries for fishers and fishing. Also in self-governance, those being governed are those who govern. As such, opportunities as first order governance occur internally within the self-governing unit rather than in external processes. So they have the opportunities to solve problems themselves because they are part of a collective. And the structure better suited for self-governing is an association. In associations, members are the decision makers. Here, Mi'kmaq fishers, as rights holders, are the decision makers. And this would help remove some of the internal conflict between the Mi'kmaq, First Nations, and importantly, bring fishers out of the margins. It would also provide opportunities to integrate the Mi'kmaq traditional governance into the self-governing unit. And within the self-governing association, two decisions must be made. First, is the species vulnerable? If yes, as currently the case for Atlantic salmon, then co-governing would be the recommended arrangement. If it is no, as in the case for lobster, then the members would proceed to the next question. Is there conflict or sharing required between fishers or fisheries of the resources? If the answer is no, then the members proceed to develop the elements. And if the answer is yes, then a two-eyed seeing interactive forum is recommended to resolve conflict or to learn perspectives. Here, the industry would have an opportunity to interact and learn with Mi'kmaq fishers. This forum can also be used to arrange sharing or solving disputes with other Mi'kmaq self-governing associations, which is also currently absent. Mi'kmaq organizations can provide legal, technical, and community support to the self-governing association where and when needed. The disciplinary tribunal external to the self-governing association would be established to address when rules were broken by its members. In interactive governance theory, self-governing is done without the control of governments. Thus, for self-governing to occur, it must do so with the agreement of Mi'kmaq governments, yet outside the control and authority of Mi'kmaq governments. So to animate the self-governing association, the Mi'kmaq First Nations must devolve authority. This is a delegation of authority to the organization. And this can be accomplished using governance tools, such as a MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, to work cooperatively, but also legal tools such as band council resolutions to transfer the authority for fisheries. The self-governing association can be the license holder under the Aboriginal Communal Fishing License Regulations. And while licenses are contentious, this would solve the issue of sale by Mi'kmaq fishers currently prohibited under provincial laws and policy. And this structure does not require a self-government agreement. And it could look something like this. So we have external support provided by, First Nations communities, technical support that may be from existing organizations that are also Indigenous or Mi'kmaq, but also legal. So there is a whole set of different organizations that can provide support to this association. The internal things that could be created would be teams or committees that would be established to address certain topics. And notice there's no hierarchy between the membership, the board of directors, and the executive committee. I see this as more of an opportunity to include collective guidance as opposed to decision makers at different levels. So I'll now move to the co-governing components. The co-governing arrangement, which is also absent, is shown here in the blue. Co-governing occurs between the self and hierarchical governing modes. The current hierarchical governing mode as DFO is shown in the gray. And the suggested co-governing arrangement is a co-management model where equal members of the self-governing and federal provincial authority are represented with an independent chair. And this is not unusual. This is a standard arrangement that's used in the land claim agreements. But importantly, essential to that co-governing mode is the two-eyed seeing interactive forum as first order governance. The industry shown in the checkbox is part of the co-governing interactions, yellow, but not part of the co-governing arrangement, meaning decision makers. So the space is needed to learn, resolve conflict, and improve transparency between the fisheries, also absent in current governance. So most decisions are made by DFO or sub-delegated to regional authorities, including license conditions and arrangements or agreements with First Nations. So to animate the co-governing arrangement, DFO can delegate authority to the co-governing unit, develop an MOU, and agreement with a self-governing association. And an example of a co-governing arrangement is pretty simple. Equal people on both sides. And for the hierarchical mode as DFO in the province of Nova Scotia for the sale of the product, alternative measures can be used, such as restorative justice for fisheries, and these can be linked to the disciplinary tribunal if needed. Laws already in place to animate the model. However, the policies require revision. I can't say this more than once. Given the diversity in the context of Indigenous peoples across Canada, regional policies would be more appropriate to address those differences and include the recognition of the treaty right here in Atlantic Canada. And policy should facilitate self-governing opportunities and the need for co-governing for vulnerable species. And also to address power imbalances, remove the issuing of licenses in situations where First Nations consent is not provided. So the standard DFO policy is if they can't come to an agreement, the minister decides if this is adequate access for First Nations and imposes licenses on the community. So federal and provincial policies should also be aligned so they're consistent with the government's of Mi'kmaq rights-based fisheries. So I'll now turn to the meta order as a final component of the model. The meta order, the values or principles underpinning governance are recommended to be Nediglim, which is the Mi'kmaq concept of sustainability, respect, reciprocity, and sharing. Imsit Nogama is the Mi'kmaq belief that all things are related and interdependent, including people. Treaty relationships as a recognition of mutual benefit and cooperation and among Mi'kmaq fishers, solidarity. And lastly, the principle of subsidiarity, which affirms the governing responsibility to the lowest capable level of organization. The Fisher Association, supported by the Mi'kmaq associations, would act as the lowest and capable level of organization. And subsidiarity is a key principle in Canada's Constitution and Canadian federalism, underpinning the division of powers between federal and provincial. But legislative power is not required. Rather, subsidiarity relies on consideration of proximity. And given that the sharing of powers between Canada and the Mi'kmaq is not yet part of Canadian federalism, the principle of subsidiarity is the current governance concept and mechanism to support self-governing of Mi'kmaq Aboriginal and treaty rights to fish in Nova Scotia. So course, there are challenges to be expected. This is a model developed based on data and case studies, but the legal tools are already in place to make governance model a reality. Policy changes are needed. Governments forget about their fiduciary obligation, which outlines the Crown must act only in the interests of Indigenous peoples. And this comes from the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And of course, political will is essential as decision makers are elected officials and public servants serve their minister. And conceptualizing governance outside the box of First Nations autonomy is a larger governance challenge to overcome. So thus, a challenge confronting the implementation of the model is for First Nations leadership to recognize the need to govern differently and to take a step back and allow Mi'kmaq fishers and the Mi'kmaq Grand Council and communities members to be part of governance. And for the Mi'kmaq fishers, the community, and Mi'kmaq Grand Council to take responsibility to do so. So political will is also essential on the Mi'kmaq side. The colonial impact of over a century of Indian Act governance ingrained in the Mi'kmaq will likely be difficult to overcome, at least conceptually, for First Nations in Nova Scotia, for the leadership and the Grand Council. So clearly there are steps needed to make the model work. And while much of this has been discussed in this model itself, the agreement from all parties going forward is needed to make the model a reality. So there is reason to hope, since the model was developed based on knowledge shared by both Mi'kmaq and non-Mi'kmaq participants, including federal and provincial governments. The potential barrier is whether it will be supported through political will, accepted responsibilities, better relationships, and ultimately doing something differently. And while the next steps might suggest peddling of the model to each group, perhaps a more effective step is to put the model to the test. My participation in former Mi'kmaq DFO negotiations suggests that both DFO and the Mi'kmaq would be amenable to testing a fishery. So to test a model, I suggest the following steps. First, build an understanding of the process with the Mi'kmaq, federal and provincial governments, and industry. In the interim, communication on the governance model could be developed and communicated with the Mi'kmaq, state, industry at multiple levels, and in particular, the role of Aboriginal treaty rights and justifications for the model. And also the role and space for Mi'kmaq fishers and industry in the governance of fisheries, such as the lobster fishery. Second, secure cooperation among the parties using MOUs and agreements. And ideally, First Nations in Nova Scotia and the two administrative regions of DFO could be in agreement to test a district-based Mi'kmaq self-governing fisher association and a co-governing process for a limited time. Frame the test period for 5 years following development of those agreements and MOUs. Secure administrative support for Mi'kmaq self-governing fishery association staff, in particular liaison. Sometimes there could be other solutions, such as using existing technical organizations or legal organizations for space and logistics. And lastly, the priority of access to Mi'kmaq districts as fishery rules must be defined. As such, an assembly of current Mi'kmaq livelihood fishers could be arranged to discuss items of sensitivity with other fishers and the Mi'kmaq Grand Council, who could provide cultural and ethical guidance. In turn, access rules could be consistent across districts without impeding access, yet based on local abundance and fisher needs. So to conclude, the results comparing the case studies did provide evidence to support that the current governing mode is neither legitimate or effective, even when vulnerability of a resource is an issue. Essentially, 3 governing modes are needed to address Aboriginal treaty rights, and 2 are missing. And while hierarchical is the recommended mode to address vulnerability of the natural system to be governed, this research provides evidence that its co-governing is more appropriate for vulnerable species such as salmon when dealing with Aboriginal treaty rights. Similarly, interactive governance theory proposes co-governing to address complexity, and this research finds that self-governing would be more appropriate to address the complex issue of legal pluralism that exists in Canadian society. And lastly, complexity in the context have a more important role as a system to be governed properties than vulnerability. The interplay of knowledge systems provide an understanding as to why they conflict and how the role of shared opportunities and common goal could develop a governance model is key. Theoretically, self-governing serves as the keystone to the alternative governance model for Mi'kmaq fisheries governance. And the use of shared values and beliefs can bridge knowledge systems and lead to greater understanding of the differences. And this is the theoretical underpinning of the use of two-eyed seeing in the development of the governance model. And lastly, as I mentioned, testing of the model is needed, and we provide that opportunity to find out what works and what doesn't, and how it could be refined and improved. You know, I reflected on, the past couple of years after, well, I guess more than be about 4 years now after doing the analysis and thinking, is this still relevant? And yes, it's definitely still relevant. And I think it's, it can be within our reach. And knowledge is not only what we know, but how we know. And I see the same as for treaty. And treaty as a verb is about doing treaty, not making new ones. It's about how we work in partnership, recognizing the sovereignty of multiple nations and coexisting. Doing treaty may not always be harmonious, but having a suitable governance model that recognizes other modes of governance as potentially legitimate has promise for enhancing the effectiveness of fisheries governance for Mi'kmaq Aboriginal treaty rights. And those mechanisms to address disharmony when it arises. Undoubtedly, the slogan, "We are all treaty people," recognizes the role of treaties in Canadian history as a necessary first step. But as we as Canadians and sovereign Indigenous nations must go beyond that recognition of the existence of treaty and simply do treaty as reconciliation. So with a few modifications to the current legal framework, particularly policy, and the development and the incorporation of other modes of governing, thus enabling the sharing of both power and responsibility, doing treaty for Mi'kmaq Aboriginal and treaty rights to fish in Nova Scotia may be closer than we realize. Lalio. It was a little over time.
Awesome. Okay. I'm gonna turn on your video's on. Okay. Are there any questions for Dr. Denny? Yeah.
We can't hear them, right?
Yeah. Any questions here?
We start with the internal questions, eh?
Sure.
So you covered a lot of ground, Shelley, and a lot of it has nothing to do with what I'm used to knowing you know about. But I know you spent 4 years doing PhD, and you've learned a lot, and I've learned a lot listening to you. I saw 3 dualities identified in your analysis, which I think are unresolved. I think they're logically resolved in terms of the way the model you've developed, but they're not resolved in terms of a stock percent, a population, an entity or resource that we exploit. So the first duality is the one between rights and economic fisheries. And while they clearly can be different fisheries in terms of the type of gear that's used, the people that are doing it, and maybe even the purpose of killing the fish, they're all the same fish and they're all coming from the same ocean. So that's one. The next one is the contrast between vulnerable and non-vulnerable. And all I would say to that is that's not a stable basis for assigning different models of fisheries management, because the vulnerable species today is the non-vulnerable one in the future, and the non-vulnerable one now is the vulnerable. And so it would mean you'd have to shift the model as the species change. And then third one, and I guess the most sort of obvious one, is the dichotomy between Aboriginal and other Canadian fishers. It looked, although I didn't hear your method here, I didn't grasp all your methods, but it looks like you didn't include non-native fishermen in your interview.
I did.
You did,
I did.
okay, good, because they're not anywhere in your model. You have Indigenous fishers and you have government, DFO, but I didn't see where they were. So those are three that occurred, and I'm sure they're probably all the kinds of dualities that someone sees when they just hear this for the first time, but those are the ones that,
Mhm.
you know, jump
Okay.
out at me.
So yes, there can, I'll go back to your first duality. There can be, you know, even competition among the Mi'kmaq between a communal license that's issued for economic gain for the community and also the economic opportunities that presents itself under fishing for a moderate livelihood. So, you know, they could be competing for the same lobster, for example, or something else, right? So I'll stick to lobster. So there is opportunity.
Would apply to the governance of all
No,
fisheries?
No. Governance of Mi'kmaq Aboriginal Treaty Rights
Right.
fisheries. So if there's no interest in expressing in Aboriginal a treaty right to fish for something, then no, there shouldn't be. But at the same time, you know, there are jurisdiction issues at play, and you know, it may be a food fishery and not necessarily a moderate livelihood fishery. So for the second question about the
Was about vulnerable and.
Oh, yes. So it's not about fisheries management, it's about fisheries governance. And the difference being, you know, get the capacity to get things done versus a management to create specific actions, right? So, you know, it's not about the specific fisheries management plan. It's about a governance model. So there's a difference between governance and management.
Are you saying that those are
And it's just-
separate?
Yes, it can be. They should be integrated within your governance for sure. But developing a fisheries management plan itself is not the same as governance. It's a piece of governance.
But regardless of whether you use the existing model or your proposed model that doesn't yet exist for Mi'kmaq fishing, you don't have a management plan except in the context of how that plan will be developed,
Oh, can you go back to the model?
implemented and enforced, right?
Yes, so when we're talking about implementing and enforced, so the Self-Governing District Fisher Association, they would be the ones to develop the plan. And they can use DFO knowledge, they can use Mi'kmaq knowledge, but something has to substantiate their plan. And this would happen here in the association. So they're supported by technical, community, and legal components to address the fisheries management plan. That's just how they're going to action their plan of their fishing.
So if it's a non-vulnerable one, there wouldn't be any co-governance?
Well, if there's conflict or sharing required between the fisheries or users of the resource, then yes, and they would go to a co-governing and two-eyed seeing interactive forum, where the industry would have an opportunity to participate and learn from each other, which we don't have right now. We don't have a forum where we can share our knowledge, share our perspectives, talk about some of the issues. There's nothing. There isn't anything. But the industry would be involved in two-eyed seeing interactive forum, but not involved in the co-governing arrangement.
So when DFO has their CSAS meetings on stock assessments and representatives of all the people that exploit it are able to go and participate, and then that forms the advice that goes to the people who make the rules, isn't that the forum for all
That's a
parties to
science, nope,
participate?
that's just a science forum. That's not an opportunity to develop relations, to build trust. to be transparent and to share information. You don't do that at CSAS.
So we have some questions online.
I think the other thing was the last one of
Oh,
your
I'm sorry.
duality. The other one was the interviewing of non-Indigenous fishers. So I was fortunate to have almost like 50-50. I had a little bit more of the Mi'kmaq than the non-Mi'kmaq, but you know, it was a really good, I think I over-interviewed, if anything. I definitely didn't under-interview. So there was, you know, a really good opportunity for me and a good way to, you know, interpret the data from my epistemology, my Mi'kmaq worldview, but also to understand from another perspective their own values, because that's what two-eyed seeing is, right? It's not just about valuing only the Mi'kmaq side or valuing only the Western side or the federal perspective side, right? It's about taking those values of each other and making something that can be workable. So like Albert said, using our differences for the benefit of all. Okay, I'm losing my voice again. I just had a lecture too before.
Thank you.
So one of the questions online. Hi, Shelley. Thanks for a great presentation. If you were Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, what would you do to improve the current system of fisheries management and governance?
Well, it's not up to the minister. It's up to everyone. You know, there are tools that are in place that can be used by DFO. There's things in the Fisheries Act, the Section 4.1, for example, that can make, you know, to actually provide that mechanism, the legal mechanism for this. But it also depends on Mi'kmaq whether they can transfer and delegate that authority to the association. So it needs to be like, it can't just be one or the other. It's got to be this joint unit of agreement and agreeing to work together, and then using those legal tools to, what I say, animate the model.
Another question online, could this model be applied to watershed governance, particularly in the context of the treaties?
I think I haven't thought of it beyond fishing, or, you know, I think this is a potential model for moose management even. It can be, I think it can be. It may involve reconsidering the co-governing arrangement and how that might work. But, you know, we don't have self-governing. If you don't have self-governing, you don't have co-governing. So like it goes back to like the chicken or the egg. You can't really do co-governing, and we're trying, and it's not working out because we're missing a key component, which is the self-governing unit.
And I think someone online had their hand up. I think it was James Bro.
Yeah, that's me.
Okay, go ahead. You can ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm a commercial fisherman, and I'm the president of North Smoky Fishermen's Association. We have members in the Gulf and in the Maritimes region. One thing that DFO doesn't seem to understand, they don't include us in discussions, even just to be there to hear what's going on. In all the years since '99, we've been to one meeting, and the Aboriginals asked the question to DFO why we weren't included. There was no answer, and they said, DFO said, well, we'll include them in the future. That's been 2 years now. I don't expect we're going to be included, but I think what seems to happen, I can understand the Aboriginal coming to different harbors and have never been there. One thing that would help them out is if they come to meet us, so they know who we are and we know who they are. But when you come into a harbor as a stranger, you know, there's a bit of animosity, and it takes a while, you know, to figure out who's who. But also, there's a bit of illegal fishing going on, and that is causing a lot of animosity. So, you've got the Aboriginals that are fishing the way they should, and then you have others that are doing what they want. And that causes a lot of animosity too. So I guess there's still work to do, but I'm pretty sure those obstacles can be surmounted by just a little more transparency. Thank you.
So essentially that, the recognition of the lack of space to bring fishers together is part of the model, because it needs to be integrated within. We can't, this is fundamental. Relationships are fundamental to this model. Not only Mi'kmaq relations, Mi'kmaq DFO relations, but also Mi'kmaq fisher and non-Mi'kmaq fishers. So, having a space to learn and talk and discuss and, learn from each other. And I think and correct me if I'm wrong, but when you say that, doing what they want to do as a part of illegal fishing, the Mi'kmaq already follow different rules than the commercial fishing industry. So they have their own policies and they have their own regulations that enable them to fish using these licenses. So in your world, in your industry world, you may see it as something that's not following your rules, but it is following rules. But thank you for your comment. And, I think what you're, I totally agree. I think that, building that relationships and starting to trust each other is key. And it's got to start somewhere, and it has to be facilitated through something. And I think by incorporating relationships between the industry at large and Mi'kmaq fishing associations, that's key to having successful governance model for this. And they're only small because I didn't have a lot of room on the paper. It doesn't mean that they're insignificant or anything. It's getting quite packed, and everything I need to say needs to be on one piece of paper. So they are very significant. So, Kevin? Question?
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
To some extent, I echo what James said regarding the opportunity for exchange is really crucial.
Yep.
And it's no surprise that a lot of us have been asking for the opportunities, and it's been frustrating.
So I mean,
that's an observation. I guess from as a commercial harvester, I'm old enough to have watched fishery change, and it was what we would have described as oversubscribed. And so the success of fishery currently has a lot to do with having matched effort to the results. And so there's of course a fear that if there's new entrants and new rules, how does
different rules. Yeah.
is that a danger? That, and I guess I'm concerned with two things. Can there, should there, would there be limits to what a modern livelihood fishery would take out of the system of that? And the other one being the question of the compatibility or conflict or difficulties implied by having two management systems working on the same resource, two different systems govern the same thing. How do we work that one out beyond the opportunities to exchange and know that each other is doing it?
So I will answer the second question because I remember it more clear. Okay, how about that one? Okay. Yeah, I mean, the legal pluralism is something that is ingrained in the Constitution. It's something that, that's the biggest challenge, but it's also the biggest opportunity as well for First Nations to be involved in the fishery, right? So being able to, fish for your needs, fishing in a cultural manner. Lobsters used to be speared one time at night. It's not uncommon to use different methods of fishing and not just the standard trap. And those things are still valued by the Mi'kmaq. So the challenge, I think, could be addressed by sharing management plans by enhancing the transparency between the two. And there's, the talk about reason for the season, and I'm a supporter of 2 different seasons until people can get along. And I base this on my observation of hummingbirds. So in the beginning of the season, hummingbirds are very competitive for that one food source. And they're always fighting, they're always at the feeder one at a time. But as the season moves on, the hummingbirds, I find, are able to tolerate each other. In fact, sometimes share at the bird feeder. And I think until we get to the point of tolerating each other and understanding and being transparent about what each other's doing, I think that's when we can truly have a more cohesive, plans for different areas. There's also the challenges of like traditional territory, which is part of the legal underpinning for marshal. Like, the traditional territory of Mi'kmaq is extends to the United States. So, just because we're on reserves in different areas, I mean, thinking about it in a district perspective enables us to go back to traditional forms of decentralized governance, essentially operating under the concept of district-based management. And I mean, like, there's even challenges within the Mi'kmaq society because people are from different districts and coming from one district and going to another, and some people don't appreciate that, and vice versa. So there are like more than just challenges with the industry. There are other challenges that we're still dealing with. So now I remember your first question or your first thing about the limit, basically, essentially. So I mean, that's what Marshall was about. It's not a full, can't get rich. That's what Marshall says. We can't be a commercial, like a full-fledged commercial fisher. We need to get our needs met, and that's it, right? So that in itself is somewhat racist. You know what I mean? So like, we can support ourselves, but we can't be wealthy. And wealth to Mi'kmaq people is different. It's about the ability to support your circle, right? So our concepts of wealth also differ in terms of monetary value, but there has been no monetary value assigned. And if like some families are multi-generational, some families live in the same home. Like some people have 8 kids and some people don't. So like everybody's needs are different.
Again,
Yeah.
I can support to some extent that I've yet to meet a
Wealthy lobster fisherman. Oh.
lots of
Yep.
quite honest.
Yep.
But I've yet to meet a fisherman who thinks that the idea of a modern livelihood is a tolerable, workable concept. I mean, what that means to you and what that means to me are very different things. So it's such a squishy thing to think about. But having said that, I guess your answer comes back a little bit to that question of how to you may well measure the modern livelihood or what you need from the fishery as this, but I'm measuring one in terms of how I finance my operation. How do we marry those 2 things, but yet maintain an appropriate level of pressure on the system? Whenever I can try to do the math around the modern livelihood or something left, the year that the price of fish is really high, that's sort of easy. When the price drops, then on the assumption that modern livelihood has to be addressed first, then how do we account for the losses on the commercial side? And those just get to be really difficult. Sometimes it would seem simpler to define limits and say, okay, this is where we're working within these spheres. It isn't socially, culturally, maybe completely appropriate, but it would go a long ways to establishing a decent rapport between people who each know what they're doing.
And it's not for me to determine how fishers get along or what they decide. And I think that's one of the key things, is to just have those discussions about what's going on. I'm sure you don't get to see their management plans, do you? No. So, I mean, those are transparency issues and they don't foster respect. Yeah. And I think that's, something that needs, yeah. I agree. And I see it from both, like, the challenges that, if I put myself in that position, I'm like, yeah, that, there is a definitely, worry and you know, that lack of transparency does not do anything, you know, to further relationships. And you know, the thing is, I find interesting is like, you know, you go to your authority, DFO, because you want to talk to the Mi'kmaq. Why don't you just call the Mi'kmaq Association to say, I know the Union of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq are assisting with the Unama'ki plans. Hey, we want to meet. Let's talk.
Some efforts,
Mhm.
and there are some instances where we do have good
Yep.
exchange. Sometimes the hierarchies on both sides
Mhm.
complicate things
Yes.
quite significantly.
Yeah. But imagine if the industry and the Mi'kmaq get together and decide what they're going to do. And then present that to DFO and say, this is, you know, this is something agreement to, and we think that this will work, and let's think about this. I don't think that's outside the realm of possibilities. Yeah, I'm hopeful, you know, and it does, you know, it does take changing a mindset, right? It does take, you know, willingness to accept responsibility. You know, the political will as well. There's a whole bunch of different compounding factors. I mean, that's why testing something, you know, may be useful, and then fine tuning it as you go. I think that for the most part, you know, I would love to see improved relations and the ability to learn from each other. I know that some of our people struggle with going to ports because that's not where they're from, but that's where they have to go. And there may not be some guidance on like, okay, so how do you approach this? We would expect some sort of like introduction. If somebody wanted to come in and work in our community, we would totally expect that as well. And why aren't we reciprocating with those same protocols and introductions?
Share stories.
Shelley, you had a slide that had a picture of a fish with people sitting inside it. It was near the front. Can
Yep.
you go to that one?
Mm. Oh, the image of the Mi'kmaq, the image of the fisheries. This one? Yes.
So I'm interested in the image of Mi'kmaq fisheries is one that supports the individuals and collectives' physical, spiritual, cultural, and economic needs, yet is self-governed, ethical, shared, responsible, conservative, respectful, and intermittent.
Mhm.
I don't understand the last one, but it doesn't matter. I think.
Actually does.
No,
It matters very much.
My question, it doesn't
Yeah,
matter.
okay.
I don't understand what that means, but, when I look at that, and I think if I went to any fisheries manager or any minister or any fisher person, no matter what their race or where they're from, they would agree with every single one of those except intermittent, which seems to suggest that, well, sometimes you do it and sometimes you don't.
Exactly. And that's one of the challenges with, you know, implementing plans. They, you know, it's there, but I don't feel like fishing today, or no, actually, I don't really need to fish today because I don't need the money. You know, so it's actually a big thing, especially when you have seasons that only dictate fishing from, you know, one time to another. And the Mi'kmaq, that's not their way. The intermittent is actually one of those things that will screw up, I think, anybody's management plans because they want to fish when they need it and they don't take a lot. So it doesn't have a huge impact on conservation, say as a whole industry fishing, you know, at one point. So, you know, the intermittent is that there may not be a need. You know what, I don't think I need the funds this year.
Yeah, but that's sort of like saying I want to go in and see the government tax agent whenever I want, rather than between the hours of 3 and 5 on alternate Wednesdays when they're open. You know, I see that, so I can, but other than that, I would say those are shared values of anybody who is serious about having killing fish be an important part of their life. you know, you can talk to the Herb Nash. And he won't use the word spiritual, but you can tell by the way he's talking, he's quite spiritual about it.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think that's a good one, that those words there, a commonality.
Mhm.
I don't, you know, if you're looking to say, well, actually, you know, it doesn't really matter who's hunting those fish, they all have the same values, well,
Mhm.
I certainly know fishermen who, when they make enough money, they stop fishing,
Mhm.
even though all their buddies are still fishing, so
Mhm.
there's that intermittency. I sort of thought the imposed intermittency was basically recognizing, hey, there are times when everybody just needs to give this species a break. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
I think that's where at least governed intermittency comes from, but
Yeah,
I
but-
like that slide a lot.
But the lobster fishery is ongoing year round, all around Nova Scotia. So there is like breaks for different LFAs, but there's no like one big break for them.
Well, I guess that's why they shift although I've always been dubious about how much science there is and how much convenience there is and where they, you know, when they open and when they close,
Yeah.
but.
And the point about the Mi'kmaq image is that they don't see it as a Supreme Court cases of Aboriginal treaty rights. They see it as together. So the treaty encompasses the Mi'kmaq way of life by including their way to be, which is the Aboriginal, the right based on original occupancy. So to them, it's the treaty just, continues that for them with the added benefit of being able to trade for the economy. So I think that's the key point in that. And the point is being, they don't see as oh, I'm going to go practice my Aboriginal right today, or I'm going to go practice my treaty right today. They just see it as their treaty right. And so that's one distinguished. And also, this doesn't really align with the tragedy of commons. So the Mi'kmaq have been able to manage themselves for a very, very long time and still maintain the sustainability of those fish species.
But not in the world we have today.
Well, they're not the only person in the world today.
That's the problem.
Well, treaty is
There's 8 billion
coexistence,
of us.
right? Treaty is coexistence. How do we coexist? How do we recognize each other's authority? How do we be able to function and still be part of the economy but still be true to our culture? And that's what, that's one of the challenges that Mi'kmaq are faced with, is that how do I continue to maintain who I am when all these other rules are imposed on me that actually aren't really there for they're there for I could see the large group when fishing, but when someone's fishing at a much, much, much smaller scale, there aren't those same risks that happen when a fishery that's happening at the scale of, say a lobster fishery in LFA 27 would be, right? Versus 28. 27 is what, 400 and I don't know, 45 licenses, I'm not sure, 5 something. Something like, it's pretty high. And then, there's like 13 in LFA 28 sort of thing, right? So like, that's the part that people don't get, is that they're losing who they are. They're losing their cultural connections. They're losing their livelihood because they're being forced into participating in a way that goes against all of those. And I think that's really, the challenge. And it is about the rules. A lot of it is about the rules. Why can they fish this way and why can't that? But the Constitution says one thing. Legal pluralism is there. There's a whole bunch of court cases that say that, yes, this is acceptable, and this is actually something that needs to be done. But there's still a lack of understanding from the other side that, the law, actually, it's Canadian law that enables this to occur. And not just our own laws of Nedigulum or our own laws of being able to sustain ourselves and as being the original inhabitants of this land, right? And having that jurisdiction.
We have one more question before we wrap up online. And the question is, statement first, well said, Doctor. Is it more than just a pipe dream to have more Indigenous parties involved in DFO, Harbor Authority, and other such areas to help with more understanding for both sides?
One thing that I've learned along the way is that sometimes we expect and then hope, I guess, that DFO will take some of the responsibility of maintaining relations and educating. And we don't see that. So I feel like since I've discovered that, I've undertaken my own, through work, relationship building, helping, and this is for salmon. I haven't ventured into lobster or anything else yet. But helping people understand what this is, because sometimes, you know, there have been instances where, you know, both, I'm losing my voice. You know, both DFO and even police have been the problem, right? So who do you trust? Who can you trust? And that's some of the challenges that they're faced with, right? They don't feel like they can trust people. They don't feel like DFO will back them up for these things. And, you know, and unfortunately, the people on the ground, the conservation, the CMP officers, conservation protection officers for DFO, you know, they're faced with so many challenges as well. You're talking about each First Nation having their own agreement with the federal government for DFO for a bunch of different species, fished at different times using different methods. So in Nova Scotia, they could be like dealing with 13 different types of agreements. So they are faced with a lot of their own, like, you know what, I don't even know where this person's from. Find out where they're from. Okay, well, this is their, you know, access, whereas somebody who lives 20 minutes away could have a completely different access. And I think that's part of the challenge. That's why the solidarity and the need to come together as Mi'kmaq in certain geographical areas will help reduce some of that complication and complexity around agreements with First Nations and DFO.
Okay, I think on that note.
I don't think I can
yes,
talk anymore.
we're good. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank